Today, we're tackling something that feels, well, utterly ingrained in our identity, doesn't it? Something we're born into, seems to stretch back through time immemorial. Yet look at it through a historian's lens, and you see it's actually remarkably modern, a modern invention.
Yeah, exactly.
We're talking about the nation, that powerful entity we feel such deep loyalty for, sometimes profound love, inspiring incredible sacrifice, even death.
Right. Despite
being, objectively speaking, a recent construction. It's a profound puzzle, isn't it?
It really is. And it's this fundamental paradox, this tension that lies right at the heart of our exploration today.
Okay.
We're drawing heavily from Benedict Anderson's, well, really seminal work, Imagined Communities, which dives deep into the cultural roots of nationalism. Anderson argues that nations aren't these inherent natural things. No, but are at their core imagined communities.
Imagined communities. That phrase itself is so provocative. It's just something constructed, maybe even a bit artificial, but holding such immense power.
Yeah.
And Anderson identifies a few key anomalies or paradoxes about nationalism that really highlight this strange nature, right?
Absolutely. He points to 3 key paradoxes that reveal how peculiar nationalism is when you start to really, pull it apart.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first, and maybe the most striking, is what we just touched on. It's objective modernity versus its subjective antiquity.
Right. The history books say one thing, but it feels ancient.
Precisely. Historians can often pinpoint the relatively recent origins of nations, tying them to specific historical events, economic shifts, political movements, often just in the last few hundred years. But for the nationalist, the person feeling that identity, the nation feels ancient, rooted in some deep immemorial past. It feels like destiny, like something that has always been and always will be.
It's not just that my ancestors lived on this piece of land. It feels like my nation existed back then, even if the historical evidence shows the political setup or the culture was completely different.
Yes. Like being born into this specific nation was somehow predetermined, not just a random accident of geography or who your parents were.
Fate, not chance.
Exactly. And that subjective feeling of ancient continuity is absolutely crucial to its emotional legitimacy. It gives your sense of belonging this depth and permanence that, well, objective history often contradicts.
Okay, that's a big one. What's the second paradox he highlights?
The second is its formal universality, alongside its irremediable particularity.
Okay, unpack that a bit. Universality and particularity.
So in the modern world, having a nationality is just fundamental. It's like having a gender or a birth date on official documents. Everyone has a nationality. It's a universal category, a standard way we classify people on passports, census forms, you name it.
Right, it's just a box you tick.
Yeah, and here's the particularity part. Every single nation is seen as absolutely irredeemably unique.
Ah, so the idea of having a nationality is universal, but the actual content of being, say, Greek is completely distinct from being Japanese. You can't just swap them.
Exactly. The specific history, language, culture, traditions, the whole package that makes up Greekness is unique to Greece and can't really be replicated anywhere else. The category nationality is universal, but each instance, each nation is seen as sui generis, one of a kind.
So there's this tension, a shared global framework of nations, but each one is totally unique inside that framework.
Spot on. It's a curious structure when you think about it.
And the third paradox, this is the one that always gets me. The immense political power nationalism wields versus its, well, philosophical poverty.
It's quite remarkable, isn't it? Think about other major global ideologies or systems of thought that have shaped the modern world. Marxism, liberalism, capitalism, even older religious doctrines or dynastic principles.
Right. They all have their big names, their foundational texts.
Exactly. Towering intellectuals, complex philosophical treatises, detailed theoretical frameworks developed over centuries. Now, where is the equivalent for nationalism? Who are the great philosophical minds whose names are synonymous with exploring the fundamental nature of the nation in the way Marx is with communism or Locke is with liberalism?
You just don't have that Kant on the nation or Hegel's theory of national spirit in the same way. It feels like it operates more on feeling shared assumptions, not so much on rigorous philosophical argument.
And this lack of deep theoretical roots, it can lead to a certain intellectual condescension.
Yeah.
Some thinkers dismiss nationalism as shallow, maybe even pathological.
Right, like it's not a serious ideology.
Tom Nairn, for instance, famously called it a modern Janus, looking both forward and backward, often with this built-in capacity for irrationality, maybe even a kind of dementia rooted in collective feelings of helplessness. But the undeniable reality is its staggering political and emotional force. For the last couple of centuries and right up to today, it shapes global events more profoundly than many well-theorized ideas. It might lack a grand philosophical system, but it inspires millions.
Okay, so our mission today in this deep dive is to really get into Anderson's analysis of how this powerful, modern, yet ancient concept, this imagined community, actually came into being culturally. How did the conditions arise that made it possible for people to even start imagining themselves as belonging to a nation of strangers? We'll look at its emergence not just as a political idea, but alongside the decline of older, really large-scale cultural systems that previously gave people their sense of identity and belonging.
Right, the ones that sort of replaced.
Exactly.
Right.
We want to understand the historical construction of nations in the imagination and maybe shed some light on why people are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, why they'll die for these abstract constructs.
It's about tracing those historical and cultural shifts, the ones that paved the way for this particular way of imagining who we are and why it holds such a potent, deep-seated emotional pull, why something historically contingent feels so natural, so immutable.
Okay, let's circle back to that first paradox then, the tension between the objective modernity of nations and this subjective sense of deep antiquity. You said this feeling is key to nationalism's power. How does that work exactly?
Well, think about it. If belonging to your nation feels like it's part of some ancient lineage, something that's always existed, it gives your own existence a sense of deep-rootedness, a continuity.
Right, I'm not just floating here in the present.
Exactly. It transforms the sheer accident of your birth being born in this particular village, speaking this dialect, into a feeling of destiny.
You weren't just born somewhere. You were born into this nation with its ancient history, its shared ancestors, its timeless identity.
It feels like fate, not just chance. This is who I was meant to be, part of this ancient stream of people. And that feeling is incredibly powerful. It provides a sense of belonging that goes way beyond your immediate family or town. It connects you to this vast historical community of people you'll never meet, stretching back into the mists of time.
So it makes the community feel natural, organic, like a really, really big family extended across time and space.
Yeah, and this subjective feeling is often so strong, it just completely overrides the historical reality of the nation's, relatively recent origin.
You see this tension sometimes even in older texts, maybe before modern nationalism really took hold, but where the complexity of identity is already bubbling up. Like Daniel Defoe's poem from 1701, The True-Born Englishman.
Ah, yes, that's a fantastic example, a brilliant piece of satire. Defoe was actually responding to xenophobic attacks on King William III, who was Dutch, you see.
Right, people were saying he wasn't English enough.
Exactly. So Defoe sets out to basically demolish the whole idea of a pure ancient English lineage. He meticulously lists every single group that had invaded or settled in England over the centuries. Saxons, Danes, Normans, Welsh, Scots, Romans.
Yeah.
Everyone.
He lays it all out.
Oh, he does, and in pretty unflattering terms, too. He talks about a mixture of all kinds being begot through eager rapes and furious lust.
Wow, not exactly a heroic founding myth. It sounds more like a chaotic mess.
He does. He paints England as this melting pot created by wave after wave of what were, at the time, seen as foreign invaders and settlers. He argues anyone claiming a pure ancient English bloodline is just deluded. He calls the result a mongrel half-bred race, a heterogeneous crowd.
He really doesn't hold back?
Not at all. But then comes the punchline, just dripping with irony. Despite this incredibly mixed, violent, definitely not pure origin story, he concludes that this nauseous brood directly did contain the well-extracted blood of Englishmen.
So even this messy, impure history somehow magically produces the well-extracted blood of Englishmen. That's fascinating.
It really is.
Yeah.
It highlights that even back in 1701, the concept of an Englishman existed and held some kind of meaning, even if the historical reality of his origins was, well, complicated and mixed. It shows the idea of the identity already wrestling with the historical facts.
It sort of foreshadows how nationalism would later smooth over all those complexities, selecting bits of history to support that feeling of ancient, singular identity.
Absolutely. Defoe's using satire to expose the absurdity of purity claims, but in doing so, he inadvertently shows that the identity Englishman has emerged and means something, even if its roots aren't simple or pure. It's a precursor to that nationalist tendency.
So how did this subjective sense of an ancient nation become such a widespread and powerful force for these entities that are, historically speaking, much younger? What big shifts had to happen in how people saw the world and their place in it?
Well, Anderson argues that the possibility of imagining the nation, of it even becoming thinkable on a mass scale, arose when three fundamental, really ancient cultural conceptions started to lose their grip. These weren't just political ideas changing, they were deep-seated ways people understood the cosmos, society, and time itself. The absolute bedrock assumptions.
Okay, assumption number one.
The first was the belief in a sacred script language.
Meaning a specific language held the key to truth.
Yes, exactly. For millennia, in many parts of the world, certain languages, think Latin in medieval Europe, classical Arabic in the Islamic world, Mandarin in China, maybe Sanskrit in South Asia, weren't just seen as tools for communication. They were believed to offer privileged access to ontological truth, to ultimate reality.
So truth wasn't just communicated by Latin, it was somehow in Latin.
That was the belief. Truth was seen as inherent in the language itself, inscribed in sacred texts or embodied in rituals performed in that specific tongue. It was the language of truth itself.
Wow, that's a powerful idea.
And it created these vast transcontinental communities, or sodalities, as Anderson calls them. Imagine communities of people who shared access to this sacred language, regardless of where they lived or what local dialect they spoke day to day.
Like Christendom united by Latin or the Ummah by Arabic?
Precisely. In medieval Western Europe, Latin wasn't just the language of scholarship in the church. Often, it was the only language actually taught in universities and monasteries. This wasn't just practical. It was about accessing truth through the sacred medium.
It bound people together across huge distances, all sharing this connection to the sacred linguistic realm.
But this certainty began to erode. It was a slow, uneven decline, but it accelerated from the 16th century onwards. You had the Protestant Reformation challenging the authority of the Latin-speaking church, pushing for scripture in vernacular languages.
Right, making the Bible accessible to everyone.
You had new scientific discoveries and explorations, offering different ways of understanding the world, ways not tied to ancient sacred texts. And crucially, the rise of print capitalism, which we'll definitely get back to, found it much more profitable to publish in languages lots of people actually spoke and read.
And the numbers really show that shift, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. The source highlights this starkly. Before 1500, something like 77% of books printed in Europe were still in Latin. That's huge.
The vast majority.
But then fast forward to the later 16th century, say after 1575, and in a major printing center like Paris, the majority of books coming off the presses were consistently in French. That's a massive, rapid turnaround.
Driven by the market, basically.
Driven by the economics of print. It pushed ideas and information out of that exclusive sacred language sphere and into the vernaculars, the languages of everyday life.
And that directly undermined the old imagined community based on the sacred language, didn't it? If truth and knowledge could be found in French or English or German, then that special bond created by Latin started to weaken.
It created alternative communities, communities of readers, thinkers, speakers, defined by the vernacular languages they shared, rather than a sacred language that spanned empires. The imagined community of Christendom, for instance, began to fray along these linguistic lines.
Okay, so the sacred language lost its unique truth-bearing status. What was the second foundational certainty that eroded?
The second was the belief that society was naturally, divinely organized under high centers, specifically monarchs or rulers, seen as fundamentally different from ordinary humans, ruling by divine right or cosmic decree. This was the bedrock of dynastic realms for centuries.
Where loyalty wasn't to a nation, but personally upwards to the king or emperor at the very top.
Exactly. Loyalties were intensely hierarchical, intensely centripetal, focused on the ruler not just as a political leader, but often as a semi-divine figure, a connection point to the cosmic order. Legitimacy flowed downwards from them, and the dynastic principle was everything. States didn't just expand through war. They expanded significantly through what Anderson calls sexual politics, strategic marriages between ruling families.
Empires built not just with armies, but with wedding rings.
Precisely. The House of Habsburg is the absolute classic example. Just look at the incredibly long list of titles for a Habsburg emperor: by the grace of God, Holy Roman Emperor, ever Augustus, King of Germany, King of Bohemia, Dalmatia, Croatia, Slavonia, Galicia, Lodomeria, Archduke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy, Lorraine, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola. It just goes on and on.
Wow. That list itself tells the story, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows one person at the top holding together this astonishing patchwork of completely different territories and peoples, all through inheritance, marriage, treaties, dynastic ties, not any kind of shared national feeling.
The famous Habsburg motto comes to mind.
Belligerant alli to Felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry. It captures that principle perfectly. Expansion through marriage, not just conquest.
And in that kind of system, how were rulers remembered? How were they identified?
It's interesting, too. They were remembered by their first names and titles. Alfred the Great, St. Stephen, Louis XIV, Ivan the Terrible. They were unique individual figures at the peak of this pyramid.
Right, standing apart.
Which is a stark contrast to how we typically remember individuals in modern national systems, usually by their last names. Surnames emphasize your place within a larger, more anonymous serial group. You're not just John the Important. You're John Smith, one of many Smiths, defined by your relation to the collective, not by a unique, divinely ordained spot at the top.
That's a really subtle but significant shift in how identity is framed. And the decline of this dynastic certainty, well, that came with things like the Enlightenment, ideas of popular sovereignty, revolutions challenging divine right.
Exactly. As the idea of the monarch as this separate, divinely sanctioned being weakened, and legitimacy started shifting towards the people or the nation, another one of those ancient anchors for identity and loyalty began to loosen its grip.
Okay, so we've had sacred language, divine monarchy. What was the third fundamental certainty that started to crumble?
This one's maybe the most abstract, but it's deeply important. The medieval conception of time, what Anderson, drawing on others, calls simultaneity along time.
Simultaneity along time. What does that mean?
In the medieval worldview, cosmology, how the universe works, and history were basically inseparable. Time wasn't seen as the linear, uniform flow we tend to imagine today. Events were often understood not just in terms of immediate cause and effect, but also in relation to ancient prophecies, scripture, the cosmic order.
So a plague or a battle wasn't just an event, it was potentially a sign, a fulfillment of prophecy.
Yes, exactly. It could be interpreted as divine judgment, or a prefiguring of the apocalypse, or fitting into God's plan somehow. History was seen as this single chain stretching from creation to the anticipated last judgment. People genuinely felt they were living at the end of time, as Bishop Otto of Freising famously put it.
So the present moment wasn't just another tick on the clock, it was potentially charged with ultimate meaning.
Right. It was part of a grand cosmic story unfolding towards a known end. And simultaneity, things happening at the same time, often meant they were linked by divine will or prefiguration, not just by happening to occur in the same hour or day.
That is incredibly different from how we see time now as this neutral, empty container measured by clocks and calendars.
Absolutely. And with the rise of secularism, science, new ways of organizing knowledge, this medieval cosmology and its view of time started to break down. It was gradually replaced by the modern conception of homogeneous, empty time.
Homogeneous empty time, like a blank grid.
Think of it like that, yeah. Like a blank, endless calendar and a ticking clock. Time is linear, uniform, measurable. Events happening simultaneously are linked only by coincidence. They occur at the same moment on the clock or calendar, but there's no inherent divine plan or prefiguration connecting them.
This sounds like Walter Benjamin's idea of meanwhile. Meanwhile, this is happening here, and meanwhile, totally unrelated, something else is happening over there.
Exactly. The world of meanwhile is fundamental to the modern novel and especially the newspaper, which routinely juxtapose completely disparate events occurring at the same time, creating this sense of a shared present happening across different locations.
Okay.
This shift from a dense, cosmologically charged time to a linear, empty clock and calendar time meant that the old ways of making sense of life, death, loss, fitting them into that grand, divinely ordained narrative, lost their power. Things like fatality, accident, contingency became much harder to integrate into a meaningful framework.
So as these three huge pillars, the sacred language, the divine monarchy, and this medieval way of understanding time slowly, unevenly eroded, driven by this complex mix of economic changes, new discoveries, developments in communication, it created a kind of vacuum, an existential void.
That's a good way to put it. People were left searching for a new way to understand who they were, how they related to others beyond their immediate family or village, and how their collective existence fit into the passage of time. The old certainties weren't providing the answers anymore.
And Anderson's argument is that nationalism was particularly well-suited to step into that void.
Yes, he argues it was uniquely equipped. It offered a new framework that could take the sheer randomness of birth fatality and transform it into a sense of deep historical continuity. It could turn the messy contingencies of history into a meaningful story, a national narrative.
Giving meaning to chance.
And crucially, it offered a secular form of collective immortality. Individuals die, but the nation, this imagined community, feels ancient and is projected to endure into an indefinite future. It provided a new basis for fraternity, power, and time in a world where the old foundations were crumbling.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It steps in to provide meaning and belonging when the older systems just don't cut it anymore.